Pay attention to what you're about to see. This security camera footage was recovered from the basement level of Riverside General Hospital. Look closely at the morgue storage area. Those gurneys lined up against the wall. Notice the body bags, some torn open, remains visible. But here's what's going to send chills down your spine. Look at the leftmost gurney. See that figure? That's not supposed to be there. Hospital maintenance thought they were walking into a routine equipment check. What they found instead would expose a medical professional's descent into madness, a grief so profound it shattered every boundary between life and death, and a secret that had been hidden in plain sight for nearly a year. This is the story of Dr. Marcus Ashford, and the night his world and his sanity collapsed in the cold basement of a hospital morgue. You know that feeling when you walk past a hospital and feel grateful you're just visiting? That it's not your emergency, not your tragedy? For the staff at Riverside General Hospital in Burlington, Vermont, that sense of professional distance shattered on a cold February morning in 2017, and what they discovered would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Burlington sits on the eastern shore of Lake Champlain, a city where everyone knows everyone, where doctors wave to their patients at the grocery store, where trust in your local hospital isn't just expected, it's assumed. Riverside General had served the community for over 70 years. It was where babies were born, where grandparents took their last breaths, where life's most vulnerable moments played out under fluorescent lights and the steady beep of monitors. Dr. Marcus Ashford had been Riverside's head pathologist for 12 years. At 61, he was exactly what you'd picture when you think of a small-town doctor. Salt and pepper beard, wire-rimmed glasses, a warm smile that put families at ease even during the worst news. He'd built a reputation for thoroughness, for treating every autopsy with the dignity of sacred work. The dead still deserve respect, he'd tell his residents. They're someone's child, someone's parent. Never forget that. Marcus and his wife Catherine had been married for 38 years. High school sweethearts who'd weathered medical school, relocations, and the quiet disappointment of never having children. But they had each other, and in Burlington's tight-knit community, that seemed like enough. Catherine taught piano lessons from their Victorian home on Maple Street. Neighbors would hear Chopin drifting through open windows on summer evenings, Catherine's laughter mixing with the music. Then everything changed. February 14th, 2017, Valentine's Day. Raymond Torres had worked as a maintenance technician at Riverside General for 6 years. The overnight shift paid better, and Raymond didn't mind the solitude, just him, his toolkit, and the sleeping hospital. His rounds were predictable. Check the HVAC systems on each floor, test the backup generators, inspect the refrigeration units in the morgue. That last task always gave him the creeps. Something about that basement level, the fluorescent lights humming in the silence, the weight of knowing what was stored behind those heavy steel doors. But it was part of the job. Raymond would get in, check the temperature logs, and get out. At 4:47 a.m., Raymond descended the stairs to the basement level. The morgue occupied the entire north wing, accessible through a double-door security entrance. He swiped his keycard and stepped inside. The smell hit him first. Not the usual astringent chemical scent of formaldehyde and disinfectant. This was different. Organic. Wrong. Raymond's hand instinctively covered his nose and mouth as he reached for the light switches, flooding the corridor with harsh white light. "Hello?" His voice echoed off tile walls. "Anyone down here?" Silence. The refrigeration units hummed their constant song. Raymond told himself he was being paranoid, that maybe one of the seals had loosened, that's all. He'd tighten it, file a report, and be done with this place. He pushed through the swinging doors into the main morgue storage area. Raymond would later tell police that his brain couldn't process what he was seeing. The human mind resists horror, tries to rationalize it into something manageable. But there was no rationalizing this. 6 gurneys lined the wall, each bearing a body bag. But 3 of those bags had been torn open, the remains exposed to open air. Instruments, surgical tools, syringes, specimen containers were scattered across a metal table. Files and papers covered every surface. And in the corner, slumped against the wall near the biohazard incinerator, was a figure. Raymond's legs gave out. He caught himself against a gurney, his hand touching cold metal, and somewhere in his shocked mind, he registered that he was screaming, that his voice was bouncing off the walls, that he was scrambling backward toward the door, his shoes slipping on the tile floor. He ran, up the stairs, through the corridors, gasping for air that didn't taste like death. He found the night supervisor in the third-floor nursing station and could barely form words. Basement, morgue, someone's down there, bodies. Hospital security reached the morgue at 5:02 a.m. They found exactly what Raymond had described, but they also found something he'd been too terrified to notice in his panic. The figure slumped against the wall wasn't moving, wasn't breathing, and scattered around him were dozens of pages covered in handwritten notes, sketches of neural pathways, and dates going back 8 months. Burlington police arrived at 5:31 a.m. Detective Lisa Reeves, a 20-year veteran who'd seen her share of strange calls, took one look at the scene and knew this was going to be different. The officer who'd done the initial sweep looked green. "Ma'am, I think that's Dr. Ashford." Lisa's stomach dropped. She knew Marcus Ashford. He'd performed the autopsy on her uncle 2 years ago, had been gentle with her family, professional. This didn't make sense. She approached the figure carefully, medical gloves snapping into place. The man was in his 60s, wearing scrubs and a white coat. His hospital ID badge confirmed it. Dr. Marcus Ashford, chief pathologist. But he wasn't breathing. Lisa checked for a pulse she knew she wouldn't find. The body was still slightly warm. Near his hand was an empty syringe and a small glass vial. Lisa leaned closer, read the label. Potassium chloride. Her jaw tightened. She knew what that meant. "We need medical examiner and CSI down here now," she said into her radio. "And somebody get me the security footage from last night. All of it." While they waited, Lisa began photographing the scene. The torn body bags, the scattered instruments, the papers covered in frantic handwriting. She picked up one of the sheets carefully. The handwriting was barely legible, words crammed together with no margin. Neural pathways degrade at 2.3% per hour post-mortem. Synaptic preservation requires temperature stability. Catherine. Must preserve Catherine. Can't let her go. Can't leave her alone in the dark. Catherine. Lisa's head snapped up. Catherine Ashford, Marcus's wife. She turned to her partner. "Did Catherine Ashford die recently?" Officer James Chen pulled out his phone, started searching. A moment later, his face went pale. 6 months ago, August 17th, 2016. Car accident on Route 89 just outside Burlington. She was pronounced dead at the scene, buried at Lakeview Cemetery. Who performed the autopsy? Lisa already knew the answer. James scrolled. Dr. Marcus Ashford. The pieces were starting to form a picture, and Lisa didn't like what she was seeing. She moved to the gurneys, comparing the toe tags with the paperwork scattered around. Most of the bodies were recent, people who'd died in the past few days, waiting for autopsy or for funeral arrangements. Standard morgue operation. But one gurney drew her attention. The body bag had been opened and resealed multiple times, the zipper damaged from repeated use. The toe tag was handwritten, not printed like the others. The name read Jane Doe number 17, but the date of death listed was August 17th, 2016. Lisa's hands were shaking as she carefully unzipped the bag. The remains inside had been meticulously preserved, treated with chemicals, carefully maintained. This body had been here for 6 months, in a hospital morgue that was supposed to process remains within days. She found the hospital's autopsy records in Marcus's files. Jane Doe, number 17, was listed as an unidentified traffic accident victim. But there was a second file, hidden beneath the first. It was labeled simply Catherine. Jesus, James whispered, reading over her shoulder. The file contained Catherine Ashford's original death certificate, an autopsy report, and then dozens of pages of notes. Marcus had documented everything: the accident, the injuries, his decision to falsify the records, his plan to keep Catherine's body in the hospital morgue indefinitely. He'd created a fake identity, processed her as an unidentified victim, and for 6 months had been coming down to this basement to be with his wife's remains. The security team arrived with laptop and external drives. "We pulled everything from last night," the lead tech said. "You're going to want to see this." They set up in the morgue's small office. Lisa watched as the tech queued up footage from 11:43 p.m. on February 13th. The camera showed the morgue entrance, crystal clear despite the poor lighting. At 11:47 p.m., Dr. Marcus Ashford appeared on screen. He was carrying a briefcase and what looked like a small cooler. He swiped his keycard and entered the morgue. The timestamp rolled forward. Midnight. 1 a.m. 2 a.m. Marcus never emerged. "Can you show me the interior cameras?" Lisa asked. The tech switched feeds. This footage was more disturbing. Marcus had gone straight to the gurney holding Jane Doe number 17, Catherine. He'd spent hours just sitting beside her, holding her hand, talking to her. Around 3 a.m., his behavior changed. He became agitated, pacing, pulling out files and spreading them across the tables. He opened other body bags, seemed to be comparing something between the remains. At 3:42 a.m., Marcus sat down against the wall near the incinerator. He pulled out a syringe and the vial of potassium chloride. He prepared the injection with the same careful precision he'd used in thousands of procedures. Then he looked directly at the camera, as if he'd known it was there all along. His lips moved. The tech turned up the audio, but the quality was poor. Just a whisper against the hum of refrigeration. "I can't leave her alone," Marcus said to the camera. "Catherine never liked the dark. I promised her. I promised I'd never let her be alone in the dark." Then he injected himself. The footage showed him slumping against the wall within minutes. His eyes stayed fixed on Catherine's gurney until they closed for the last time. The timestamp read 3:51 a.m., 3 hours before Raymond Torres would discover the scene. Lisa had to step outside the office. She'd handled murders, suicides, terrible accidents. But this was different. This was love twisted into something unrecognizable. Grief so profound it had destroyed a man's ability to distinguish between honoring the dead and desecrating them. The medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Wong, arrived at 7:15 a.m. Patricia had worked with Marcus for years. When Lisa told her what they'd found, Patricia sat down hard on a gurney. No, Marcus wouldn't. After Catherine died, he took a week off, but he came back. He seemed okay. Quiet, but okay. How did we miss this? That was the question haunting everyone. How does a respected doctor, surrounded by colleagues, hide something like this for 6 months? As the sun rose over Burlington, the hospital went into lockdown. Staff were told there'd been an incident, that the morgue was temporarily closed for investigation. Word spread quickly. In a small city like Burlington, secrets don't keep long. By noon, reporters were gathered outside. By evening, the story was national news. But the investigation was just beginning, because as Lisa and her team dug deeper into Marcus's files, they realized the situation was even more disturbing than they'd thought. The notes, the experiments, the repeated examinations of other bodies. Marcus hadn't just been hiding Catherine's remains, he'd been conducting unauthorized research, using the morgue as his personal laboratory, and the question everyone was asking was, how far had he gone? The morning after the discovery, Detective Lisa Reeves sat in the Burlington Police Department conference room, surrounded by file boxes, photographs, and the weight of questions that didn't have easy answers. The medical examiner had confirmed what everyone already knew. Dr. Marcus Ashford had died from a self-administered lethal injection of potassium chloride. Time of death approximately 3:55 a.m. on February 14, 2017. But cause of death was the easy part. Understanding why, that was going to take longer. Lisa's team had spent the night cataloging everything from the morgue. 37 notebooks filled with Marcus's handwriting. Hundreds of pages of research papers, most dealing with post-mortem neural preservation and cellular decay, detailed logs documenting his activities over the past 6 months, and dozens of vials containing tissue samples that were now being analyzed by the state crime lab. "Walk me through the timeline," Lieutenant David Park said. He was a stocky man in his 50s, approaching retirement, and this case was making him reconsider whether he wanted to stay in law enforcement at all. "How did nobody notice for 6 months?" Lisa pulled out her notes. "Okay, Catherine Ashford died on August 17, 2016, around 2:30 p.m. Single car accident on Route 89. She lost control on a curve, vehicle struck a tree. Death was instantaneous from blunt force trauma. State police processed the scene, body was transported to Riverside General." "Where her husband was chief pathologist," David added. "Right. Marcus performed the autopsy himself that evening. According to the official record, he documented the cause of death, signed off on cremation, and released the remains to Morrison Funeral Home. Morrison's records show they received a body on August 19th, cremated it on August 21st, and delivered the ashes to Marcus at his home on August 23rd. David frowned. "So he has ashes? Then who's in the morgue?" "That's the thing. The ashes Morrison cremated, not Catherine. Marcus had switched the bodies. He used a recent Jane Doe, an elderly homeless woman who died of exposure 2 days before Catherine's accident. He falsified the toe tags, the paperwork, everything. Morrison never knew the difference. They cremated the Jane Doe thinking it was Catherine Ashford." "And the real Catherine?" Lisa slid a photograph across the table. The morgue's interior, the gurney with Jane Doe number 17. "Marcus created a completely fake identity for her, listed her as an unidentified traffic accident victim from a different incident, put her in the system as awaiting next of kin identification, then he just kept her there." David ran his hand through his graying hair. 6 months. How did the hospital not catch this? "Hospital protocol says unidentified bodies are held for 30 days while they attempt identification. After that, if no family claims them, the city takes responsibility for burial in a county cemetery. But Marcus was the one who controlled those records. He kept filing extensions, kept claiming he was running additional tests to establish identity. His authority as chief pathologist meant nobody questioned it." The door opened and Officer Chen entered with 2 coffees and a grim expression. "Just finished interviewing the hospital staff. Nobody had any idea. Marcus's behavior changed after Catherine died. People said he was quieter, more withdrawn, but he still showed up for work, still performed his duties. If anything, he was working more hours than before." "More hours," Lisa repeated, "because he was spending his nights in the morgue with Catherine. They'd pulled all the security footage going back 6 months. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. 3 to 4 nights per week, Marcus would enter the morgue between 11 p.m. and midnight. He'd stay for hours, leaving before the morning shift arrived at 7 a.m. What he did during those hours painted a picture of a man slowly losing his grip on reality. The notebooks told the story in Marcus's own words. The early entries from August and September were almost clinically detached. He documented Catherine's preservation, the chemicals he was using, the temperature controls. He wrote about maintaining her dignity, about his responsibility as both her husband and her physician. But by October, the tone shifted. The handwriting became more erratic. Whole passages were underlined, circled, connected with arrows and marginal notes. Marcus began writing about his research into neural preservation, about his belief that some part of consciousness might persist after death if the right conditions were maintained. He referenced obscure studies, theoretical papers that mainstream science had dismissed decades ago. He was having a breakdown, Patricia Wong, the medical examiner, said when Lisa showed her the notebooks. Patricia sat in her office at the state medical examiner's building, the place where she'd worked alongside Marcus at conferences, where they'd collaborated on difficult cases. "This is magical thinking. Post-mortem neural preservation isn't possible. The brain begins dying minutes after the heart stops. There's no awakening protocol." Marcus knew this. He taught this to residents. "But he stopped believing it," Lisa said. "Grief does terrible things to rational minds," Patricia said softly. "I knew Marcus for 15 years. He was brilliant, dedicated, but Catherine was his entire world. They never had children, never wanted them. It was just the two of them. When she died, especially so suddenly, so violently, I think something in him broke. The investigation expanded beyond the morgue. Lisa's team executed a search warrant on Marcus and Catherine's home on Maple Street. The Victorian house that had once hosted piano lessons and summer parties was now a shrine to a dead woman. Catherine's clothes still hung in the closet. Her toothbrush stood in the bathroom holder. The calendar in the kitchen was still turned to August 2016. Marcus had preserved the house exactly as it had been the day Catherine died, as if expecting her to walk through the door at any moment. But it was Marcus's study that revealed the depth of his obsession. The walls were covered with papers, research articles, hand-drawn diagrams of the human brain, timelines tracking cellular decay rates. In the closet, they found boxes of medical supplies that Marcus had been stealing from the hospital, refrigerated storage containers, preservation chemicals, surgical instruments, and they found letters, dozens of them, written from Marcus to Catherine over the past 6 months. Letters describing his day, asking about hers, making plans for a future that could never happen. The most recent letter was dated February 13th, 2017, the day before he died. "My dearest Catherine," it began, "I've come to understand that I can't maintain this forever. The preservation is failing. I can see the signs, and it breaks my heart. I promised you I would never let you be alone, and I intend to keep that promise. Tomorrow is Valentine's Day. Do you remember our first Valentine's Day together? We were 17. I was so nervous. You laughed at me, but you said yes. 38 Valentine's Days we've shared. I won't let you spend this one alone." The letter went on for 3 pages, reminiscing about their life together, apologizing for what he was about to do, but justifying it as the only choice he had left. "People will call this madness," Marcus wrote. "They'll say I lost my mind, but they don't understand love the way we do. They don't understand that living without you isn't living at all." Lisa had to step away from the desk. She'd been a detective for 20 years, had seen every variation of human violence and tragedy. But this wasn't violence. This was devotion twisted beyond all recognition, love so profound it became indistinguishable from insanity. The state crime lab results came back 2 weeks later. The tissue samples Marcus had collected weren't just from Catherine. He'd been taking samples from other bodies that passed through the morgue over the past 6 months, running experiments, comparing tissue degradation rates. None of it was illegal. He had authority to conduct research as part of his position. But it was deeply unethical, and it confirmed that Marcus had been using the hospital morgue as his personal laboratory. "We need to notify the families," David Park said, when Lisa briefed him on the lab results. "Everyone who had a loved one autopsied by Marcus in the past 6 months needs to know their remains may have been used for unauthorized research." That conversation would take weeks. Over 50 families had to be contacted, told that while their loved ones' bodies hadn't been desecrated or mishandled in any obvious way, the doctor they'd trusted had been conducting secret experiments. The hospital's legal team went into overdrive. The medical board launched their own investigation, and the media descended like vultures, turning Marcus and Catherine's tragedy into tabloid headlines. But Lisa kept digging, because something about the case still bothered her. The timeline didn't quite add up. Marcus had been so careful for 6 months, hiding Catherine's body, maintaining the facade, managing his double life. What had changed on February 13th? What had finally pushed him over the edge? She found the answer in the hospital's records. On February 10th, 2017, the hospital administration had announced a new policy. All unidentified remains more than 60 days old would be transferred to the county medical examiner's office for centralized processing. The policy was set to take effect February 20th. Marcus would have known what that meant. Jane Doe number 17, Catherine, would be transferred out of his control. She'd be moved to a different facility, processed by different people, eventually buried in an unmarked grave in the county cemetery. He'd lose access to her forever. He couldn't allow that, so he made his choice. The deeper Lisa dug into Marcus's background, the more she understood just how catastrophic Catherine's death had been for him. She interviewed Marcus's sister, Rebecca, who flew in from Portland after hearing the news. Rebecca was a psychiatric nurse, and her insights painted a fuller picture of her brother's psychology. "Marcus was always intense," Rebecca told Lisa over coffee in a quiet diner. "Even as kids, when he loved something, he loved it completely. He decided he wanted to be a doctor when he was 12, and from that moment on, every single choice he made was in service of that goal. Same with Catherine. He met her when they were 15, and that was it. There was never anyone else for him." "Did you notice any changes in him after her death?" Lisa asked. Rebecca stared into her coffee. "I called him every week after the funeral. At first, he seemed to be handling it. Sad, obviously, but functional. But around October, maybe early November, he started saying strange things. He'd talk about Catherine in present tense, like she was still alive. I'd correct him gently, and he'd laugh it off, say it was just habit, but it kept happening." "Did you think about getting him help?" "I suggested it. He shut me down completely, said he was a doctor, he knew how grief worked, he was fine, and Marcus could be very convincing when he wanted to be. He had that authority, you know? That confidence that makes you doubt your own observations." Rebecca's voice cracked. "I should have pushed harder. I should have flown out there, seen him in person. Maybe I would have noticed." Lisa reached across the table, touched Rebecca's hand. "This isn't your fault. Your brother hid this very carefully. He fooled everyone." But Rebecca just shook her head. Did he, though? Or did we all just not want to see it? Because seeing it would have meant confronting something uncomfortable, something that reflected badly on all of us? The community of Burlington struggled to process the revelation. Marcus Ashford had been a trusted figure, a man who'd helped families through their darkest moments. Now that trust felt violated, the hospital held town halls, brought in grief counselors, tried to rebuild confidence in their procedures. Lisa attended one of these meetings, watching from the back of the room as hospital administrators fielded angry questions from citizens who felt betrayed. One woman stood up, her voice shaking. "My father died last October. Dr. Ashford performed his autopsy. You're telling me that while he was examining my father, he had his dead wife hidden in the same room? That's not just unethical. That's desecration." The hospital's chief medical officer, Dr. Eugene Bradford, tried to respond calmly. "Ma'am, I understand your anger. We share it. But I want to assure you that every autopsy Dr. Ashford performed was done to the highest standards. His personal tragedy didn't compromise the medical integrity of his work." "How can you say that?" another person shouted. "The man was clearly insane." "He was grieving," Dr. Bradford corrected. "There's a difference." Was there, though? Lisa found herself wondering about that distinction as the meeting devolved into angry accusations and defensive explanations. At what point does grief become pathology? When does mourning cross the line into madness? The security footage became a focal point of endless debate. The hospital wanted to keep it sealed, arguing it served no public interest and violated Marcus's dignity. But the district attorney's office insisted it was essential evidence, and ultimately portions of it were released to the public. Carefully edited to remove the most disturbing elements, but enough to confirm the basic facts of the case. Lisa watched the public's reaction unfold on social media, in newspaper editorials, on television panel discussions. Opinion was sharply divided. Some saw Marcus as a monster, a doctor who'd violated every oath he'd taken. Others saw him as a tragic figure, a man destroyed by love and unable to accept loss. The debate raged on for weeks. What struck Lisa most was how few people seemed to land in the middle, acknowledging that Marcus could be both, that he could be simultaneously a grieving husband deserving of compassion and a medical professional whose actions were indefensible. Humans want simple narratives, clean categories. They don't like the messy reality that most people contain multitudes, that tragedy doesn't erase culpability any more than wrongdoing negates suffering. By March 2017, the investigation had moved from criminal inquiry to administrative aftermath. There would be no trial, no prosecution. The perpetrator was dead by his own hand. What remained was the painstaking work of understanding what had happened and ensuring it could never happen again. The Vermont State Medical Board's investigation was thorough and damning. They reviewed every autopsy Marcus had performed in the past year, every report he'd filed, every procedure he'd overseen. Most were impeccable, the work of a skilled pathologist who took his responsibilities seriously. But interwoven through his legitimate duties were the threads of his obsession. They discovered he'd been falsifying equipment maintenance logs to hide his after-hours presence. He'd been routing certain bodies through different processing channels to avoid oversight. He'd created shell documentation that looked legitimate but led nowhere. The depth of his deception suggested planning, intent, awareness of what he was doing, which made his descent into magical thinking about neural preservation all the more tragic. Part of Marcus's mind had remained rational enough to hide his actions, even as another part had abandoned reason entirely. The hospital's internal review was equally comprehensive. Riverside General had to answer difficult questions about oversight, about how a senior physician could operate unmonitored for 6 months, about what safeguards had failed. The morgue's protocols were completely overhauled. New positions were created: morgue operations manager, ethics compliance officer, oversight committees with external members. The administrative response was textbook: identify the failures, implement corrections, demonstrate accountability. But for Lisa Reeves, the bureaucratic aftermath felt hollow. She kept returning to the security footage, watching Marcus in those final hours. She'd studied the timestamps, tracked his movements, tried to understand his state of mind. The footage from February 13th showed Marcus arriving at the morgue at 11:47 p.m. He'd brought his briefcase and a small cooler, the same items he'd carried on previous visits. The interior cameras showed him going through his routine. He'd checked Catherine's preservation, adjusted the temperature controls, sat beside her gurney holding her hand. But then, around 2:30 a.m., something shifted. Marcus had pulled out all his notebooks, spread his research across the tables, and for 90 minutes had been frantically reviewing everything he'd documented. His body language showed agitation, distress. At 3:15 a.m., he'd done something he'd never done before. He'd opened other body bags, examining the remains stored in the morgue. This was the footage that had haunted Raymond Torres's discovery, the scene that would become central to understanding Marcus's final hours. The security camera had captured everything in stark, clinical detail. Marcus moving from gurney to gurney, his medical training evident in how he handled the remains, but his actions serving no legitimate purpose. Lisa had consulted with Patricia Wong about this behavior. "What was he doing?" Lisa asked. "Why examine those other bodies?" Patricia had thought carefully before answering. "I think he was confronting reality." For 6 months, Marcus had maintained this delusion that Catherine could somehow be preserved, that some essential part of her remained. But he was a pathologist. He understood death better than almost anyone. Examining those other remains, bodies in various stages of decomposition, bodies he'd likely autopsied himself, I think he was forcing himself to acknowledge what he'd been denying. Catherine was gone. There was no protocol, no preservation technique that could change that. It was this realization, Lisa believed, that had led Marcus to make his final decision. The video showed him sitting against the wall at 3:40 a.m., pulling out the vial of potassium chloride and the syringe. He'd prepared the injection with steady hands, the muscle memory of thousands of medical procedures guiding him even now. Then he'd looked at the camera and spoken his last words. "I can't leave her alone. Catherine never liked the dark. I promised her. I promised I'd never let her be alone in the dark." The audio quality was poor, but the state lab had cleaned it up, enhancing Marcus's voice against the background hum of the morgue systems. When Lisa had first heard the enhanced audio, she'd noticed something she'd missed before. Marcus's voice wasn't just filled with despair, there was relief in it. The relief of someone who'd been carrying an impossible burden and was finally setting it down. The toxicology report confirmed that Marcus had used enough potassium chloride to cause cardiac arrest within minutes. Death would have been quick, relatively painless. He'd administered it the same way he'd ended the suffering of terminal patients who'd made the difficult choice to stop life support, professionally, efficiently, with the minimum of distress. The state prosecutor had reviewed the case file and made the decision not to pursue any charges posthumously. "What would be the point?" Assistant District Attorney Karen Liu told Lisa. Marcus Ashford committed multiple violations, falsifying death certificates, mishandling remains, conducting unauthorized research, stealing hospital supplies. But he's dead. And honestly, even if he were alive, I'm not sure this case would be winnable. The defense would argue diminished capacity would paint him as a man destroyed by grief, and they'd be right. The hospital settled quietly with the families who'd been affected by Marcus's unauthorized research. Non-disclosure agreements were signed. Financial compensation was provided. The hospital's insurance carriers negotiated, lawyers haggled, and the whole messy situation was wrapped up as cleanly as possible. But some questions couldn't be answered by legal settlements or policy changes. Lisa had interviewed dozens of people who'd known Marcus and Catherine, colleagues, neighbors, friends. The picture that emerged was of a couple deeply, completely devoted to each other. High school sweethearts who'd never looked at anyone else. They'd moved to Burlington 12 years ago when Marcus accepted the position at Riverside General, and Catherine had quickly become part of the community fabric. Her piano students remembered her patience, her warmth, the way she'd made learning feel like play. They were inseparable, Marcus's colleague Dr. James Thornton told Lisa. Hospital functions, community events, they were always together. When Catherine died, it was like watching someone lose their oxygen supply. Marcus kept functioning, but something essential was gone. One of Catherine's former students, a young woman named Emily Parker, who was now studying music at the University of Vermont, reached out to Lisa after the story broke. Emily wanted to share something about the Ashfords that she thought was important. They met at a coffee shop near campus. Emily was 22, earnest, still processing the revelation about her former teacher's fate. "Mrs. Ashford wasn't just a piano teacher," Emily said. "She was like a second mother to a lot of us. When my parents were going through their divorce, I was 13 and falling apart. Mrs. Ashford would let me stay after lessons, just talking. She never charged extra time. She'd make tea and we'd sit in her kitchen and she'd tell me that pain doesn't last forever, that I'd survive this." "She sounds like a remarkable woman," Lisa said. "She was, and Dr. Ashford, I met him a few times when he came home early. He'd always kiss her on the cheek, ask about her day, really listen to her answers. They had this ease with each other, like they spoke a language nobody else understood. My mom used to say they were proof that soulmates exist." Emily's voice dropped. "When I heard what Dr. Ashford did after she died, everyone was saying how sick it was, how disturbed. And I get that, I do. But part of me also thought, if someone loved me the way he loved her, if someone couldn't imagine existing without me, would that really be the worst thing? I know that's messed up. I know what he did was wrong, but I can't help feeling sad for him, too." Lisa understood what Emily was trying to articulate. The case had forced everyone to grapple with uncomfortable questions about love and obsession, about where devotion ends and pathology begins. There were no easy answers. The Ashford house on Maple Street was eventually sold. A young family bought it, repainted the rooms, filled it with new memories. Catherine's grave in Lakeview Cemetery, the real one, where her actual remains were interred after the investigation concluded, became a place where former piano students would leave flowers. Marcus was buried beside her, despite some community objections. His family had argued that whatever he'd done out of love, not malice. They deserved to be together. The morgue footage became a critical piece in the investigation's final report. When reviewing all the evidence, it was that security camera recording from February 13th that allowed investigators to piece together Marcus's final hours and understand the progression of his breakdown. The timestamps on the footage correlated with entries in his notebooks, with hospital records, with witness statements. It painted a complete picture of a man's descent and his ultimate decision. Lisa included a detailed analysis of the footage in her final case report. She noted every movement Marcus had made, every action he'd taken. She described how he'd systematically examined each body in the morgue that night, how he'd compared their states of decomposition, how he'd spent 23 minutes with his hand pressed against Catherine's body bag before finally accepting what he'd known all along, that she was truly gone, that no amount of preservation or research or desperate hope would bring her back. The report detailed how Marcus had then methodically cleaned his workspace, filed his papers into neat stacks, arranged his research materials as if preparing them for someone else to discover. He'd even written a brief note to the hospital administration, apologizing for the inconvenience his actions would cause and requesting that his final paycheck be donated to the hospital's patient assistance fund. But what Lisa remembered most was something that couldn't be captured in timestamps or evidence logs: the expression on Marcus's face in those final moments. The enhanced footage showed it clearly. It wasn't fear or regret. It was peace. The peace of someone who'd been drowning and finally decided to stop fighting the current to let the water take them. The case officially closed on April 30th, 2017. The file was thick, hundreds of pages of reports, interviews, lab results, photographs. Lisa placed it in the archives herself, sliding it into a box labeled Ashford Marcus 2017, closed. But that night, alone in her office, she'd pulled out one last piece of evidence: the final letter Marcus had written to Catherine, dated February 13th, 2017. She read it again, paying special attention to the closing paragraph. "When people ask me if I have any regrets, I'll tell them no. Not about loving you, not about the life we built together, and not about this choice. They'll call it tragic, call it a waste, call it mental illness. Let them. I know the truth. I know that every moment with you was worth whatever comes next. I kept my promise, Catherine. You'll never be alone in the dark. I'm coming with you." Lisa carefully placed the letter back in its evidence envelope. She thought about love and madness, about where the line between them disappeared. She thought about the security footage, about Marcus's final moments, about a grief so consuming it had destroyed a brilliant man's ability to accept the most fundamental truth of human existence: that death is final, and that love, no matter how profound, cannot change that. The Riverside General Hospital morgue was renovated and reopened in June 2017. New protocols were in place. New oversight systems were implemented. The basement no longer felt haunted, or maybe it did, but people learned to work through it. Life went on because life always does. But sometimes, late at night when the hospital was quiet, security guards swore they could hear something from the basement level. The sound of the refrigeration units opening and closing, the whisper of movement in empty corridors. They told themselves it was just the building settling, old pipes, air in the system. Raymond Torres, the maintenance worker who discovered the scene, transferred to a different hospital 3 months after the incident. He couldn't walk past the morgue entrance without feeling his heart race, without smelling that smell, without seeing Marcus's body slumped against the wall. He underwent therapy for PTSD, eventually found peace with what he'd witnessed, but he never worked another overnight shift. Some things, he said, change you in ways you can't undo. The Ashford case sent ripples through the medical community far beyond Burlington, Vermont. Medical schools began incorporating new ethics training focused on physician mental health and recognizing signs of grief-related cognitive distortions. Hospital morgues nationwide reviewed their oversight protocols. Vermont passed legislation requiring dual sign-off on all autopsy reports and mandatory peer review of preservation procedures. The legislation was named the Catherine Ashford Memorial Healthcare Oversight Act, a bittersweet honor that Catherine's family accepted with mixed emotions. Her younger brother, Thomas, spoke at the bill signing ceremony. "My sister would have wanted something good to come from this tragedy," he said. "She believed in finding light even in dark places. This law won't bring her back, and it won't undo what Marcus did. But if it prevents another family from experiencing this kind of pain, then maybe something meaningful can emerge from meaninglessness." Catherine's former piano students established a scholarship in her name at the Burlington School of Music. Every year, a young pianist receives funding for their education, along with a reminder that Mrs. Ashford believed music could light up even the darkest moments. They don't talk much about how she died, or about what her husband did afterward. They prefer to remember the woman who taught them that wrong notes weren't failures. They were just opportunities to find the right ones. The scholarship has funded 12 students so far. Several have gone on to successful music careers. One, Emily Parker, returned to Burlington after graduate school and now teaches piano herself, continuing Catherine's legacy in ways both intentional and instinctive. She keeps a photo of Catherine in her studio, along with a plaque that reads, "Music is the language of the soul when words fail." The Ashford house on Maple Street still stands, now filled with the laughter of children who don't know its history. The new owners, the Martinez family, discovered some of Catherine's old sheet music in the attic during renovations. They framed several pieces and hung them in the hallway, a small tribute to the woman who'd once filled these rooms with Chopin and Brahms. Neighborhood kids walk past it on their way to school, never realizing that the Victorian home with the cheerful yellow door was once the center of a national news story about love, death, and the places where grief can lead us. Riverside General Hospital recovered, though it took time. Families who'd been affected by Marcus's actions slowly rebuilt their trust in the institution. The hospital administration established a victims fund and brought in external consultants to completely overhaul their policies. Today, the hospital is known for having some of the most stringent morgue oversight procedures in the country. They conduct monthly audits, require dual authorization for all after-hours morgue access, and maintain 24/7 video monitoring with regular security reviews. Dr. Eugene Bradford, the chief medical officer, created a mandatory wellness program for all hospital physicians, particularly those working in high-stress or death-exposed specialties. The program includes regular mental health screenings, peer support groups, and immediate intervention protocols for physicians experiencing traumatic life events. "We failed Marcus Ashford," Dr. Bradford said in an interview 2 years after the incident. "We saw the signs, the isolation, the long hours, the withdrawal, and we told ourselves he was coping. We need to stop accepting fine as an answer when we know someone is drowning." Detective Lisa Reeves retired from the Burlington Police Department in 2022. The Ashford case wasn't her last, but it was the one she thought about most often. In interviews, she said that it taught her something important about the job, that not every case fits neatly into categories of good and evil, victim and perpetrator. Sometimes you encounter something more complicated, a tragedy wrapped inside a tragedy, where everyone involved is both and neither. Lisa now teaches criminal justice at Vermont State University. She uses the Ashford case as a teaching tool, challenging her students to grapple with the ethical complexities it presents. "This case forces you to hold two truths simultaneously," she tells them. "Marcus Ashford violated professional ethics, broke laws, and desecrated his wife's remains. That's true. It's also true that he was a man destroyed by grief, unable to cope with loss, who saw suicide as the only way to end his suffering. Both things are true. Your job as investigators isn't to decide which truth matters more, it's to document what happened and let society figure out the rest." Dr. Patricia Wong still serves as Vermont's chief medical examiner. She's testified before Congress about the need for better mental health support for medical professionals, particularly those working in fields with high exposure to death and trauma. She talks about Marcus sometimes, about the colleague she thought she knew, about the warning signs she wishes she'd recognized. "Marcus and I had lunch together 3 weeks before he died," Patricia said during one congressional testimony. "I asked him how he was doing. He said, 'Fine.' I noticed he'd lost weight, that he looked tired, but I didn't push. I let him say 'fine,' and I moved on to talking about work. I think about that lunch all the time. What if I'd pushed? What if I'd said, 'Marcus, you're not fine. Let's talk about what's really going on.' Would it have changed anything? I don't know, but I'll spend the rest of my career making sure other people don't make the same mistake I did." The security footage from that February night remains in the evidence archives. Researchers and ethicists have requested access to it for studies on grief psychology and medical ethics. The requests are always denied. Some things, the Burlington Police Department has decided, don't need to be public spectacle. Some tragedies deserve to remain private. Marcus's sister Rebecca established a nonprofit organization called the Ashford Foundation, dedicated to providing grief counseling and mental health support specifically for medical professionals. The foundation operates support groups in 15 states, offers crisis intervention hotlines, and provides scholarships for physicians seeking mental health treatment. Marcus's story doesn't have to be just about tragedy, Rebecca says. It can also be about the importance of seeking help, about recognizing when grief becomes something more dangerous, about not letting pride or professional identity prevent us from acknowledging when we're drowning. The Foundation's work has been credited with preventing several physician suicides and helping hundreds of medical professionals access mental health care they might otherwise have avoided. It's a legacy Marcus never intended to create, but perhaps the most meaningful one he could have left behind. No criminal charges were filed in this case, as Dr. Marcus Ashford died by suicide before any legal action could be taken. However, the investigation identified multiple violations that would have resulted in charges had he survived, including falsifying death certificates and government documents, 11 counts. Abuse of corpse, multiple counts. Theft of hospital property and medical supplies, estimated value $47,000. Fraud in the performance of medical duties. Violation of medical ethics protocols, 14 separate violations. Improper disposal of human remains. Identity fraud, creating false documentation for Jane Doe number 17. Unauthorized medical experimentation on human tissue. The Vermont State Medical Board posthumously revoked Dr. Ashford's medical license and struck his name from the state medical registry. Riverside General Hospital was fined $750,000 by state regulators for oversight failures and required to implement comprehensive policy reforms under the supervision of an independent compliance monitor for a period of 5 years. Catherine Ashford's remains were finally laid to rest properly on May 15, 2017. The service was small, private, attended only by close family and a few former students. Marcus was buried beside her 2 weeks later. Their shared headstone bears a simple inscription, "Together, always." The inscription was Rebecca's choice. Some family members objected, feeling it romanticized Marcus's actions. But Rebecca insisted. "They were together always," she said. That was the promise they made to each other, and in his twisted way, Marcus kept it. I'm not saying what he did was right. I'm saying their love was real, even if grief corrupted it into something unrecognizable. The headstone acknowledges the truth of their relationship, while letting each visitor decide for themselves what that truth means. If you visit Lakeview Cemetery in Burlington on a quiet afternoon, you might find their graves near the back under an old maple tree. Sometimes there are flowers there, roses usually, though no one knows who leaves them. The groundskeeper says they appear every Valentine's Day without fail. Fresh-cut roses, tied with a white ribbon, placed carefully between the two headstones. When asked about it, the groundskeeper just shrugs. "Some love stories," he says, "don't end the way we expect them to." Catherine Ashford taught us that wrong notes are just opportunities to find the right ones. In death, she taught us something else, that love, in its purest and most terrible form, can transcend every boundary we think is immovable. Marcus Ashford dedicated his life to understanding death, to treating it with dignity and respect. In the end, he chose to cross that boundary himself, driven by a promise he couldn't bear to break and a loneliness he couldn't bear to face. This is the story of the Ashfords, not a love story with a happy ending, but a love story nonetheless, one that asks us to consider what we'd do, how far we'd go, if we lost the person who made our world make sense. It's a question none of us wants to answer. But somewhere in Burlington, Vermont, in a quiet cemetery under a maple tree, two people rest side by side. And every Valentine's Day, someone remembers. Someone leaves roses. And maybe, just maybe, no one is alone in the dark.